Hi guys, I'm now through week 3 of my 100 Days Making Comics challenge. This week I wanted to talk to those of you out there who are maybe thinking about making a comic yourselves and why I think you should try and go for it. I think a pep talk's probably needed for comics in particular, as opposed to just illustrations, because I think there's a different sort of pressure associated with things that have a writing element to them, at least for me as an illustrator. For me, it feels like it's one thing to draw a character looking cool, maybe even illustrating a scene with a strong sense of storytelling to it, but it's a whole other feeling to have a sequence of events you're trying to explain and a story, or maybe even a message you're trying to get across. It's just a lot more personal, and I think you're bearing a different part of yourself when you do that. I was much more anxious putting out a visual novel into the world than I ever have been putting an artwork out. For Print Sitting 2, the launch was really scary. I don't really feel that way about posting artwork, and maybe it's because it's what's comfortable to me. I've done it plenty of times before, and I know it's not a scary thing anymore. But storytelling, both in comics and really any other medium, is still a pretty new thing to me in comparison. I want to encourage anyone who's even thinking about attempting to make a comic to just go for it though, because I really think it's a good way to connect with people. Even as a visual person, I don't really fall in love with artworks the same way that I do with a good story. I don't obsess over a good artwork like I would with a good character. There's just something in our brains that loves to pick apart a compelling narrative for information, and I think there's a lot of potential there to invite your audience in and to interact and connect with you more. I really mean it when I say that I love every single comment that I get, where people say that they love my artwork and that they love my style, and I've worked really hard to make something I like looking at and that I'm happy to share with other people, and I do enjoy when people feel the same way, but I think it's a lot more difficult to achieve impact with a pretty picture than it is with a story. I got a lot of really thoughtful, kind comments in response to my visual novel, people relating their experiences and comparing it with my character Alex's struggles, and I was really surprised at the depth of resonance. I'd never really gotten comments like that before, but I knew the feeling. I have felt that way about a lot of characters from different media before, and I was really happy to be able to create that with my own stories too. I think there's a lot to gain from comics or visual novels that just isn't present with illustration alone. So if you're compelled to do stories as well as draw, I definitely think you should aim to do both. Not that art alone doesn't have its value, again, I mostly do illustration work, but even with my small dips into telling stories, I can see how people really seem to connect with storytelling in a way that art alone just doesn't quite get at. Even though there's a potential for a more meaningful connection, I don't think you should put it off until you're a better artist or until you think you're ready, because combining art and story is such a complex skill with a lot of little nuances. I also think building up something in your head without working on it is bad for the anxiety side of things, and it sort of feeds that perfectionist in you that stops you from posting, which ultimately hurts your growth. I mentioned in the last video that I've been a fan of a lot of YouTube indie manga creators, and I noticed that above all else, a lot of times people get sucked into the planning stages and they just have a hard time getting out of it. Print Sitting, being my most successful attempt yet, has had the least amount of time put into it, and I think it's by far the best. I'm not hung up on getting these complex characters across. I think the complexity emerges more organically this time, and I have a lot of story to tell and a lot to cover, but I don't think I'm fighting to get to that point. I'm just enjoying making comics. I literally was just talking to my friends one night, and I said something like, I really should have some of my own characters to do stuff with, and then in response to that, I got asked, like, well, why don't you? And then the next morning, I was drawing pages with the idea of, well, let's just see how far this goes. And it turned out to be fun, and I just kept it up, and within the first month, I had enough content to launch Print Sitting publicly, and I still have a bit of a backlog. So yeah, I think you should go for it and finally give making that comic or telling that story you've been wanting to tell a go. You don't have to overthink it either. It doesn't have to be complicated or a deep story at first. Just draw what's fun and you'll probably find yourself building it up more naturally. Not that it has to be some kind of grand epic story. It can just be simple. That's totally fine too. But I think you should sort of let yourself decide in that process of making it what it's going to be. At least that's what's been serving me very well this time around. I think for a lot of people, once you actually start getting into it, once you actually start making the thing properly, a lot of the problems seem to solve themselves, or at least are now tangible enough to deal with, instead of being abstract and scary and just kind of vaguely present and anxiety-inducing. I definitely think you should at least try, and I hope me talking a little bit about why I think that could be helpful to someone. So that's about it for this week. If anyone actually has any comic projects, I'd love to see them, especially if they're on webtoons. Currently, I don't have a lot of content I'm following, and I would really like to expand my reading list. I'll also have a link to my visual novel that I made, as well as Print Sitting, the webcomic featured in these videos, down in the description below if anyone would like to check those things out. I hope everyone has a good week ahead of them. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you back next week for week 4 of the challenge.